The storm found Elias Ward at the one wall he trusted most. Not the roof, not the door, the wall. He stood in the main room of his best cabin on the muscle-shell bench, watching a white seam crawl along the inside logs like chalk being dragged by an invisible hand. The stove was glowing orange, the iron was ticking. Splinters of pine snapped in the firebox so hard they sounded like small bones breaking, but the frost kept growing. Inside the room, inside the house he had built. Elias did not touch it at first. He just stared, because every man in that country knew his work. He could set a corner square by eye. He could choose a beam by the sound it made when he struck it. He had built houses for ranchers, storekeepers, 2 freight bosses, and 1 judge who had claimed no wind in Montana could ever worry a Ward wall. Now winter had put its finger through one. Elias reached for the hatchet beside the stove. There was a chair near the table, a good chair, ash wood, pegged by hand. If he split it and fed the stove hotter, maybe the wall would dry before dawn. Maybe the room would win. His hand closed around the handle. Then he stopped. Because chopping up his own furniture would not be about warmth, it would be about admitting the widow had seen something he had not. 2 miles east of him, under a low hill of frozen grass, Ruth Bellamy was asleep inside the stone house everyone had mocked. 8 months earlier, when the thaw still left black mud under the wagon ruts, Ruth Bellamy walked the slope behind her old timber cabin and marked the ground with a flour sack string. Her husband had been dead for 3 winters, her son Caleb was 10, her daughter Annie was 7. Both children had learned to sleep in coats when the wind shifted north. The old cabin was not broken enough to be abandoned. That was the trouble, it was just poor enough to take a little more from them every winter. The corner by Annie's bed always chilled first, frost gathered around the nail heads. The window frame breathed when the wind struck it. Ruth had spent too many nights waking at 1, then 3, then, before dawn. Not because the baby cried or the animals called, but because the fire had fallen and the room had started taking heat back from her children. One night Caleb rose before she did and carried a log to the stove in the dark. He did it quietly, like a grown man. That was when Ruth decided the cabin had taught him the wrong lesson. In April, she opened a small cedar box that had belonged to her father. He had cut stone before he ever crossed the plains. Inside were pencil drawings, lime recipes, chimney notes, and margins filled with sentences that sounded less like instructions than warnings. One line stayed with her. Wood spends heat fast, stone keeps an account. Ruth read it 3 times. Then she walked outside and looked at the hill. By May, she was hauling rock. Sandstone from the ridge, flat river stones from the creek bed. Heavy pale blocks for the firebox from an abandoned quarry cut no bigger than a cellar. She loaded what the mule could pull. When the mule was needed for planting, Ruth pulled the drag herself. Neighbors slowed on the road and pretended they were not counting. A widow building in stone was a story before it was a house. At Whitaker's store, men shook their heads over coffee. Stone is a grave material, one said. Stone sweats, said another. Stone will steal the heat out of her children before Christmas, said a third. Ruth heard all of it because news in a settlement traveled faster than a horse and came back uglier. She did not answer. She set the back wall into the hill where the earth would cover it like a quilt. She kept the roof low so heat could not wander overhead and disappear. She faced 2 narrow windows south and made the north side nearly blind. Around the firebox she laid thick stone, not pretty, but dense. Caleb carried chips in a pail. Annie sorted small wedges by shape. Ruth's hands opened and cracked and bled into the lime. In July, Elias Ward rode over. He dismounted without asking permission, the way skilled men sometimes do when they believe skill belongs to them alone. He walked around the half-raised wall, touched the mortar, looked at the hill, and gave one short laugh. "You are building a cellar with windows," he said. Ruth kept her trowel moving. "A good log wall breathes," Elias told her. "A stone wall drinks cold." Ruth pressed one stone into the bed of mortar and tapped it level. "Cold stone drinks," she said. "Warm stone remembers." Elias smiled as if she had made a child's poem out of a grown man's trade. "You will be back in timber before the first hard storm." Ruth looked at the wall, not at him. "Then I had better finish before it comes." By September, the house was done. It was not handsome from the road. It sat low under the hill, with thick walls, a blunt chimney, and a doorway half sheltered by earth. No porch, no decorative gable. No proud high window to catch the sunset. But the first cold night gave Ruth her answer. She made a small fire after supper, let it burn down to coals, then waited. In the old cabin, the room would have started to fall away from the stove almost at once. Heat would have climbed to the rafters, fled through gaps, and left the beds in a shallow pool of cold. In the stone house, the air changed slowly. It thickened, it settled. Annie slept through the hour when she normally coughed. Caleb did not stir. Ruth sat with her back against the wall and felt no bite through her shawl. The house did not feel warm like a stove feels warm. It felt as if the night had been kept outside a second door. Then November came, the first day of the storm. Nobody called it a storm. They called it weather. The sky lowered, the grass went silver, snow blew in thin threads across the road. Men carried extra armloads inside and told themselves they had planned well enough. By afternoon, the wind had lost its gusts and become one long shove from the northwest. By dark, chimneys were smoking sideways. At Whitaker's store, the men stood too close around the stove and stopped pretending they were only there for tobacco. Orrin Whitaker measured his wood stack with his eyes and did not like the answer. Every time the door opened, the room seemed to shrink. Elias Ward returned home before supper and found his wife with blankets pinned over the children's beds. The east wall was already weeping cold. He fed the stove, the room brightened. The heat came fast, almost triumphant. Then the wind leaned again, and the heat vanished just as fast. That was the first lesson of the storm. A hot fire did not mean a warm house. 2 miles east, Ruth added 3 sticks of cottonwood after dawn and closed the stove draft. She was not trying to make flame. She was trying to feed the walls. Caleb sat at the table with a slate. Annie sat on a stool near the hearth, barefoot under her blanket, drawing shapes in spilled flour with one finger. Outside, snow dragged across the south windows in pale ribbons. Inside, the lamp flame stood straight. That was what Ruth noticed most. Not the warmth, the stillness. The old cabin had always spoken in weather. Corners whispered, sashes rattled, boards popped, the wind found places to put its mouth. Here, the storm struck the house and got no answer. Near dusk, someone knocked. Not the bold knock of a visitor, 3 small blows spaced too far apart. Ruth opened the door and had to lean her weight into it. Mrs. Larkin stood on the step with a scarf iced to her cheek and her little boy tucked under one arm, limp with sleep and cold. Ruth did not ask a question. She pulled them in, shut the door, and waited for the warmth to return. It did. Not as a blast, not as a miracle, as a steady account being paid back. Mrs. Larkin knelt beside the stove and held the boy's hands between her own. Then she looked at the fire. It was small. Her eyes moved from the fire to the stone wall. She put her palm against it. Her face changed. Nobody had to explain. On the second night, the bench became a place of counting. Counting logs, counting blankets, counting children in beds, counting how long a door could be opened before a room lost what it had gained. At the store, 9 families crowded under one roof while Orrin rationed wood by the hour. Men argued without raising their voices because loud anger wasted breath. Frost hung along the inside of the front windows. A barrel of apples near the wall froze solid at the top. Elias stayed in his cabin because leaving would mean admitting defeat to the house itself. By midnight, the frost appeared along the inside seam. At first it was no wider than a thread, then it widened, then it branched. It was beautiful in the most insulting way. Elias put on gloves and pressed his hand to it. Cold went through the leather. The wall was not leaking wind like a broken shutter. It was worse than that. It was losing the argument slowly across its whole body. Every log that had looked square and tight in autumn now held a hairline of winter. He threw in more wood. The fire roared, the wall stayed white. His youngest daughter woke crying, not from fear, but from the kind of cold that enters a dream before a child understands it. Elias lifted her and set her near the stove. His wife said nothing. Silence can accuse better than speech when the truth is standing in the room. That was when Elias reached for the hatchet. And that was when he remembered Ruth Bellamy's sentence, "Warm stone remembers." By the third morning, the store thermometer had fallen so low that nobody trusted it. Someone claimed 38 below. Someone else said 40, it did not matter. The number had stopped being information and become a dare. A trapper named Gideon Vale came down from the breaks with frost on his beard and no feeling in 2 fingers. He passed 3 cabins before he reached Ruth's store, because smoke from her chimney rose thin and calm, not frantic. He knocked once and nearly fell inside. Ruth guided him to the bench by the wall. He sat, breathing through his teeth. After a minute he took off one glove and placed his hand on the stone. He kept it there, then he looked at the wood stacked under the lean-to. "You been burning all day?" he asked. "No," Ruth said. "All night?" "No." He stared at the stove, then at the room, then at the wall under his hand. "How many?" Ruth did not know what he meant until his eyes moved back to the wood pile. She counted in her head. 9 sticks since it turned bad. Gideon laughed once, but there was no humor in it. It was the sound a man makes when a fact has stepped on his pride. 9. Ruth nodded. He stood before dark and went to the store. By evening, the story had outrun him. The widow's house had burned less than a cooking fire. The widow's walls were warm. The widow's children had slept. People wanted to dismiss it, but the storm had made dismissal expensive. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The silence after it felt almost rude. Doors opened across the bench. Men came out stiff-backed and hollow-eyed. They measured the storm by what it had consumed. At the Dodd place, the wood stack was nearly gone. At the Larkin cabin, frost had melted down the wall and pooled under the bed. At the store, 23 people had slept in shifts and nobody had truly slept at all. At Elias Ward's house, the inside seam had thawed into a dark line that ran from the ceiling to the floor. He stood before it with a rag in his hand. He did not wipe it. He saddled his horse. The ride east took him longer than it should have. The snow was deep, yes, but that was not why he went slowly. A man can cross 2 miles quickly. He cannot cross his own certainty so fast. Ruth was clearing packed snow from her doorway when she saw him. She did not wave, she did not smile, she only pushed the door open and left it that way. Elias stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was that there was no drama in the room, no roaring stove, no smoke smell, no wet blankets hanging everywhere. No children pressed against the hearth as if the floor beyond it were dangerous. Caleb was mending a harness strap at the table. Annie was asleep in the corner with one bare hand outside the quilt. Elias removed his hat. Then his gloves. He walked to the north wall and placed both palms flat against the stone. His face tightened, not with cold, but with recognition. The wall was not hot. That was what unsettled him. Hot could be faked with enough fuel. Hot could be bought for one desperate hour. This was different, this was stored. He turned toward the stove. The fire was only a red bed under gray ash. How much wood? He asked. Ruth answered without pride, 9 sticks in 4 nights. Elias looked at her as if she had handed him a ledger that proved he had spent his life counting the wrong thing. From inside his coat, he pulled a folded page. It was damp at the edges. He spread it on the table. A drawing, not a stone house, not a timber house, a timber shell with a stone belly, packed earth against the cold side, a low ceiling, a rebuilt hearth mass, a way to keep the old cabin standing, but teach them to hold heat instead of chase it. Ruth studied the drawing. This will work, she said. Elias swallowed. I drew it beside the stove, he said, while my wall was freezing. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said the sentence that cost him more than money, I was wrong. Ruth did not forgive him out loud. She did not need to punish him either. The storm had already done the honest part. She pointed to the buried wall. Start where winter hits first. By noon, Elias was at the Dodd place, measuring the east wall. By the next week, men who had laughed at Ruth's stone house were carrying stone in sledges. Not because they had become humble. Humility is rare, but proof is heavy, and they had felt it with their own hands. Orrin Whitaker posted a paper outside the store. 2 columns. Average wood burned in timber cabins during the storm, wood burned at Bellamy's stone house. He did not decorate it with opinion, he did not have to. People stood in the cold and read the numbers twice. In February, Elias finished the first rebuilt cabin. Timber outside where it was quick and familiar, stone mass inside where winter had done the damage. Hacked earth on the windward wall, south window tightened. Stove set against a wall that could remember. The Dodd children slept through the first cold night after the work was done. Their mother cried in the morning and pretended the smoke had done it. After that, nobody called Ruth's place a cellar with windows. They called it the Bellamy house. Then, quietly, they called the method by her name. Spring came late that year. Snow thinned along the ridges and left black ribs of earth showing through. Ruth and Caleb stood outside the stone house repairing one place where freeze and thaw had shifted a wedge near the doorway. Caleb held the line while Ruth tapped the stone back into truth. Who taught grandfather? He asked. Ruth set the wedge and wiped mortar from her wrist. Someone before him. And before that? Someone before that. Caleb looked at the wall as if it were older than the house. So names go away. Sometimes. He pressed his palm to the stone. But the work stays. Ruth looked at him and nodded. Years later, the house under the hill was still there. The roof was replaced, the stove was replaced, the children left and returned with children of their own. But the walls did not hurry. And they did not apologize. Every winter, when the wind came down hard enough to make timber creak and doors complain, there was one low house on the mussel shell bench that did not fight the storm with noise. It kept the heat it had been given, it kept the account. And when morning came, it still had something left.